Keepsakes from a life well lived or clues to an early demise? The things left behind at celebrity death scenes always tell some revealing stories.
In 1991, Kurt Cobain, along with Dave Grohl and Krist Novoselic, made rock history and practically created the grunge movement with their revolutionary album Nevermind. But Cobain was already tired. In a Rolling Stone interview, he said, "All I need is a break and my stress will be over with." Cobain struggled with heroin abuse and suffered from deep depression, and his heroin addiction, tumultuous relationship with Courtney Love, and fame-induced stress sent him down a rabbit hole. Cobain tried to take his life in March 1994. Love checked herself into rehab, hoping to convince Cobain to join her, but in April, Cobain borrowed a gun from a friend and took his life at his home in Seattle. He was found 4 days later after his mother had filed a missing person report.
The lead singer of the enormously popular rock band Nirvana is dead. Apparently, he was a suicide at the age of 27.
2 decades after his death, police released images from Cobain's death scene to debunk murder conspiracies. At the scene were Cobain's borrowed shotgun, a cigar box containing drug paraphernalia, his famous sunglasses, a woolly trapper hat, and his suicide note, which he left in a plant pot with a pen stuck through the middle. Amy Winehouse won a staggering 5 Grammys in 2008 when she was only in her 20s. Her 2006 album Back to Black topped the charts worldwide too. Over time, though, the singer became as famous for her drug use and eating disorder as she did for her voice. Her brother, Alex Winehouse, later told The Guardian that he believes it was her bulimia, not her rampant drug use, that brought about her demise. He said, "You knew just by looking at her, she would have died eventually, the way she was going, but what really killed her was the bulimia." Amy Winehouse was severely affected by both her fame and the pressures of the music industry. The lack of anonymity that came with stardom worsened her drug abuse and bulimia. In June 2011, the BBC announced she had canceled her tour to solve several personal issues. On July 23rd, her bodyguard found her fully clothed, face down on the bed of her North London home. She had died of alcohol poisoning. Next to her body was a laptop on which she had been watching videos of herself performing. There were 2 empty vodka bottles on the floor. Keith Relf became a rock star in the early 1960s as the frontman of the Yardbirds. If his name didn't make the headlines that often, it's probably because he was seriously overshadowed by his bandmates, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page. When the Yardbirds broke up in 1968, Jimmy Page took over the new Yardbirds, and the band soon changed their name to Led Zeppelin. But that isn't Relf's only connection to Led Zepp. He also contributed to Jimmy Page's iconic reimagining of Jake Holmes' Dazed and Confused, which would eventually become a Zeppelin staple. Sadly, though, Relf didn't get to make much rock and roll history afterward. His 3 subsequent rock groups didn't meet much success, and on May 14, 1976, Relf's life came to a sudden end. He was playing the guitar in his home cellar when he stepped on a gas pipe and was fatally electrocuted. He and the guitar in question were reportedly found by his 8-year-old son. In 2009, Michael Jackson was preparing for a huge comeback via a series of farewell concerts at the O2 Arena in London. Jackson fans were so enthusiastic that 360,000 registered applications before ticket sales started, and the 10 concerts were up to 50.
I'm just never satisfied with what I do creatively, you know. I just regret the limitation of my own imagination.
Jackson was struggling with severe insomnia at the time, however. He had gone 60 days in a row without experiencing REM sleep. With this came a myriad of issues. He had paranoid episodes, he would talk to himself, and he was unable to remember lyrics or dance moves. That's when Jackson's doctor Conrad Murray chose to prescribe him propofol. Propofol is an anesthetic that should never be used as a sleep aid, however, as it doesn't induce REM sleep in the patient. On June 25, 2009, Jackson was found dead. The death scene included bottles of propofol and benzodiazepines, the combination of which triggered the fatal overdose. There was also an IV drip, Bennington tubes, an oxygen tank, a cardiology book, and for some reason, a vintage doll. The Mamas and the Papas' haunting voice belonged to Cass Elliot, a singer well-beloved by her audiences but harangued by the fatphobic views of the American public. Elliot's struggles with her weight were even referenced in her song lyrics. Eventually, she began a radical diet. Elliot fasted 4 days a week for 7 months in a row, eventually losing 110 pounds, but ending up in the hospital in the process. The next year, Time reported that Elliot was continuing her dangerous diet. She joked that it cost her $2,000 a pound, as she had to cancel $250,000 worth of shows while she was in the hospital. She said, "The Mama Cass diet can give you acute tonsillitis, hemorrhaging vocal cords, mononucleosis, and a case of hepatitis." On July 29, 1974, Mama Cass was found dead inside her London apartment. She had suffered a heart attack, believed to be the result of her intense dieting. But it was the ham sandwich found on her bedstand that triggered a fatphobic rumor that Elliot had died choking on a sandwich. It was a bad joke that ignored Elliot's many efforts to lose weight and, in a way, her illustrious musical career.
We have breaking news tonight. Out of Los Angeles, the death of singing star Whitney Houston at the age of 48.
While Whitney Houston was an internationally acclaimed singer, she also struggled with substance abuse and a rocky personal life. During the 1990s and 2000s, Houston was married to musician Bobby Brown, and their relationship became a frequent topic of discussion, with mentions of serious drug abuse and even violence. Brown later spoke on A&E's biography, Bobby Brown, and explained that both he and Houston had serious addiction problems. He claimed that he wasn't the bad boy painted by tabloids or the man who had gotten Houston hooked on drugs. Houston and Brown's marriage ended in 2007, but she continued to overindulge in narcotics. On February 11, 2012, she was found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hills Hilton. At the scene were a hairbrush, 2 hairbands, several prescription drugs, and olive oil, which was mixed in with the water. The official cause of death was drowning, facilitated by heart disease and cocaine use. Chris Cornell was one of the big faces of the grunge era as the leader of Soundgarden. In 2017, he and his band were on tour after a temporary hiatus. Soundgarden would give their very last show at the Fox Theater in Detroit, Michigan on May 17th. After the show, Cornell returned to his room at the MGM Grand Hotel. But about a half an hour before midnight, his wife noticed the lights in their Los Angeles home were flickering on and off. Cornell could activate them from an app in his phone, so she started worrying about his state of mind. When his wife called him, Cornell reportedly slurred his words. She didn't believe him when he said he'd only taken a couple of Ativan doses, so she called Cornell's bodyguard, Martin Kirsten, to go check on him. Just after midnight on May 18th, Kirsten entered the room and found Cornell dead. He had taken his own life. The police officers that arrived at the scene eventually found medication bottles containing prednisone, omeprazole, and lorazepam. The death scene photos also show Cornell's guitar case, sunglasses, a deodorant bottle, and a contact lens case. During his career, the king of rock and roll had 108 Billboard Hot 100 hits, 129 Billboard 200 charted albums, and a total of 67 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard 200. In the last year of his life, however, Elvis Presley had retreated from the spotlight and become addicted to junk food, as well as a plethora of prescription and non-prescription drugs. On August 16, 1977, Presley's girlfriend Ginger Alden found him lying unconscious on the floor of their bathroom in the Memphis mansion Graceland. When the paramedics arrived at the location, they found an empty bottle of painkiller tablets and a vial of trisolerin, a tanning drug. When the paramedics took Presley to the hospital that day, they found much more in his system, several opiates, quaaludes, and codeine. He was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m. His physician, Dr. George Nikopoulos, ultimately had his license suspended for prescribing Presley many of the substances that got him killed. Aaron Carter became a teen favorite in the early 2000s, with hits such as Aaron's Party, Come Get It, and That's How I Beat Shaq. In fact, Carter already had 3 best-selling albums by the time he was 13, but teenage stardom can come with a plethora of problems. In Carter's case, it was his parents who spent $500 million from his money, and the problems didn't end with his teens.
Do you feel like you're an addict?
Of course I'm an addict.
Yeah.
I don't have to feel like it, I am.
Carter struggled with substance abuse, and in 2017, he confessed that he didn't believe he would live past the age of 30 when he was younger. He told Us Weekly, "I dealt with a lot of trauma, a lot of loss, a lot of loneliness. I just felt like I needed to get away. My goal is to be the phoenix that rises from the ashes." In 2022, Carter's situation started to look grim once more. He lost custody of his son and was fighting to get him back in September of that year. In November, his housekeeper found him unresponsive in his bath. He had drowned, aged 34. A TMZ report described the death scene. In the bathroom and bedroom were bottles of prescription medication and cans of compressed air in bottles, hinting at a substance-related drowning. Janis Joplin arguably epitomized the hippie era. She was also a fresh voice in a male-dominated genre and a very promising artist all around. However, Joplin also struggled with heroin addiction. On October 4, 1970, she was discovered dead in her Hollywood hotel room. She was found clutching money in one hand and a box of cigarettes in the other. 3 days later, her body was cremated and her ashes were scattered by her family into the Pacific Ocean. This was bad news for Joplin's friend, Peggy Caserta, who believes Joplin didn't really die of a heroin overdose, as she had used the same batch around the same time as her and claimed it wasn't particularly potent. The full reality of her death, as well as the meaning of the money and cigarettes, might remain a mystery forever. Not only was Chester Bennington the voice of Linkin Park, but he was also the heart and soul of the group. With him at the forefront, the band scored 6 #1 albums on the Billboard 200 and electrified fans around the globe with their unique musical blend of rock, hip-hop, electronica, and metal, as well as their angst-ridden and poignant lyrics. On July 20th, 2017, Bennington was found dead at his California residence. TMZ obtained a toxicology report that revealed further details about the singer's passing, as well as what was found at the death scene. According to the outlet, Bennington had taken his own life. In his pockets, investigators found coins and a boarding pass for a flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles. A handwritten journal containing what was purported to be Bennington's biography was found in the room, as well as a typed biography in the drawer of a nightstand. In addition, the officials discovered an iPhone, a half-empty bottle of Corona, one empty bottle of beer, a prescription for Zolpidem, and other miscellaneous items scattered around the bedroom.
When Patsy Cline was killed in a plane crash on March 5, 1963, she had only been singing for a surprisingly short time. The crash took the life of the 30-year-old Cline, along with fellow country music stars Hawkshaw Hawkins and Cowboy Copas, and Cline's manager, Randy Hughes, who was also the plane's pilot. The cause of the crash was officially ruled as having been due to pilot inexperience and bad weather, and it was bad weather that Cline had been aware of. The oft-told tale is that even as she waved aside concerns over her flight from Kansas City back home to Nashville, she reportedly told Dottie West, "Don't worry about me, Haas. When it's my time to go, it's my time to go." In 1996, a show called Friends & Company did a retrospective on the crash site and interviewed one of the first people on the scene. Jerry Pfeiffer shared that the entire crash site was strewn with their gear, from clothes to guitars, amplifiers, and equipment.
It was a very dreadful scene and something I'd never experienced before and hope never see again.
Some of the items recovered from the crash site have been included in exhibits about her life, including a lighter in the shape of a Confederate flag and a watch given to her by her husband. Hughes's journal was also recovered from the site, documenting the last of the singer's tour dates. John Denver was killed on October 12, 1997, when the plane he was flying crashed not far off the coast of California. It took more than a year for the National Transportation Safety Board to finalize its report on what had happened. Interestingly, there were several significant things that weren't recovered at the scene, including the logbook and the autopilot. The plane was, however, recovered piecemeal but mostly complete, and initially, two things seemed to point to a possible cause of the crash. The windscreen was shattered into pieces, and there were a lot of duck feathers found. Given that the seat cushions were labeled as being filled with goose feathers, not duck, that led to the initial theory that bird impacts had caused the crash. After consulting with experts from the Museum of Natural History, it was found that the label wasn't entirely right, and the cushions included duck feathers too. That possibility eliminated, it was later ruled that the inconvenient location of the handle that toggled between fuel tanks, behind the pilot, was ultimately responsible, and that Denver had lost control while trying to move the handle. When Hank Williams Sr. died at the incredibly young age of just 29 years old, 20,000 people attended his funeral. What happened in the hours around his death, just as 1952 became 1953, is part history, part myth. Williams had been on his way to Canton, Ohio, when he died in the back of his Cadillac, which was being driven by a college student he'd hired to get him to his concert after bad weather made flying impossible. That college student turned driver was Charles Carr, and in 2002, he sat down with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to talk about that fateful night. Carr recalled helping Williams, dressed in white boots and a hat with a blue coat, load his gear into the Cadillac and picking up a six-pack of Falstaff beer. Although they had intended to stop for the night, the concert promoter told them that they needed to keep going to make it on time, so they did. Carr was in West Virginia when, troubled by the eerie silence, he pulled over and went back to check on Williams. The blanket he'd been covered with had slipped off, and Carr knew he had to find a hospital. When his body was removed from the car later, some full cans were still there, along with a few empty ones. Also in the car were notes Williams had written, with unfinished song lyrics. Carr recalled the last words Williams said, to anyone who heard anything at least, "I just want to get some sleep." There are a few different stories about what happened on the night Tammy Wynette died, and they're recounted in Jimmy McDonough's biography, Tammy Wynette, Tragic Country Queen. What is known is that Wynette died at home on a sofa on April 6, 1998. According to the testimony her then-husband George Ritchie gave to the press, he and Wynette had been napping on the sofa in the kitchen when his daughter called at 6:55 p.m. He then saw a note taped to the kitchen table that the housekeeper had left at 6:05 p.m., saying she was running to the store. When Ritchie returned to the sofa, he discovered Wynette had died. Ritchie, however, had previously told police that both he and the housekeeper had found her body, raising questions about the housekeeper's note. Ritchie called Wynette's personal physician, Wallace Marsh, in Pittsburgh. In the time it took for the doctor to reach Nashville, Wynette remained on the sofa. Friends, family, and Wynette's daughters came in and out of the home, and according to Ritchie, an unnamed acquaintance removed all of Wynette's medical records, prescriptions, and paraphernalia from the scene. But what happened to them remains unclear. Marsh certified that Wynette's cause of death was a blood clot in her lungs, but her daughters were unconvinced. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Marsh and Ritchie. Wynette's body was exhumed and an autopsy was performed. It was ruled that the cause of death had actually been heart failure, caused most likely by blood clots that had previously collected in her lungs. Naomi Judd died by suicide on the day before she and her daughter, Winona Judd, were due to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Her death started a very important conversation about how much the public is entitled to know and how much privacy should be respected. Not 2 weeks had passed since Judd's April 30th, 2022 death when her daughter Ashley Judd sat down with Diane Sawyer. Ashley said that she had been put forward as the family's spokesperson, as they knew that information was going to be made public and they wanted to speak before that happened.
When we're talking about mental illness, it's very important and to be clear and to make the distinction between our loved one and the disease.
By August, the family was involved in a highly publicized court case in an attempt to keep the details of Naomi's death private. Although they were initially granted a temporary verdict, confirming that things like official investigation reports and photos were not to be released, they ultimately were. Outlets including the New York Post and Radar Online ultimately ran photos of Naomi's bed, showing the hurriedly written post-it note she also left behind. Since then, Ashley has spearheaded a movement to prioritize sensitive reporting and allow families to keep images, recordings, and evidence private. She told The Guardian, "The dark past in God's hands becomes our greatest asset. With it, we can avert misery and death for others." Ricky Nelson was the son of stars Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, and a massive genre-crossing star in his own right. He, his fiancée, and other band members were killed in a plane crash on January 1st, 1986, and just what happened was, from the beginning, sketchy and misreported. Initial reports confirmed his death without getting into too much detail, saying that whatever had happened on the flight, it had caused a fire to burn so hot that rescue workers had to wait to recover remains. It didn't take long for the headlines to start the chatter. Nelson's manager, Greg McDonald, and brother David Nelson both issued statements saying that early reports claiming the fire had broken out because the plane's passengers were freebasing cocaine were completely untrue. The reports ran in multiple reputable media outlets, while officials replied that nothing had actually been determined at the time the news hit. At that early stage, they did confirm that while aerosol cans had been found at the site, they had been in the baggage compartment, discounting the drug theory. It was later reported that the likely cause of the blaze, crash, and deaths was a faulty heater on board the plane. And perhaps strangest of all was the fact that when the investigation was finished, some of the wreckage, including the tail of the plane, was left behind at the crash site. It was eventually installed at the Williams House Museum in DeKalb, Texas. When Justin Townes Earle's death was announced in 2020, there was no cause of death officially released. But it wasn't long before the New York Times reported that the autopsy findings had led to a determination that he had died of an accidental drug overdose. The toxicology report found that he had cocaine and fentanyl in his system, and it was in line with information Fox News had obtained from the Metro Nashville Police Department's Don Aaron. While Aaron didn't reveal exactly what first responders had found, he did say, "The preliminary investigation, which takes into account observations at the scene, indicates that death is likely related to a drug overdose." Earle's father, outlaw country star Steve Earle, later recorded and released an album of his son's songs, and those recordings started even before the official cause of death had been issued. He called the album cathartic and noted that he had been all too familiar with his son's addictions. He recalled their last phone call. "I said, 'Do not make me bury you,' and he said, 'I won't.'"
No trouble figuring out what the worst year of my life is, and that's saying something.
On September 4th, 2019, sheriffs and first responders from Taos County, New Mexico, responded to an accident scene involving 3 cars. 2 women were dead, and in a pre-investigation statement to Taos News, Sheriff Jerry Hogreff didn't pull any punches. "At this time, I will say with most certainty that Miss Cruz was an innocent victim of this senseless crash caused by Miss Harris. Miss Cruz was 16-year-old Maria Elena Cruz, who had been driving home from work when the crash occurred. Harris was on her way to a music festival when she clipped the car in front of her and crossed into the opposite lane, hitting Cruz in a head-on collision. Making the story even more tragic is the fact that Cruz's father, a deputy fire chief, had been driving along the same stretch of road when he came upon the accident.
Very traumatic for him to not know, but to respond anyway, and then find that it was his family member.
Details of exactly what happened came from 2 places: Harris's autopsy and the onboard computer recovered from her car at the scene. While the autopsy revealed that she had been driving with a blood alcohol content of more than 3 times the legal limit, the computer revealed details just as telling. Harris's speed at the time of the impact with the first car was recorded at 102 miles per hour, and at the time she hit Cruz's car, she was clocked at 95 miles per hour.
I have never in my entire life had, up until a certain point, never had a suicidal thought.
After country music star Mindy McCready died by suicide in 2013, news outlets across the country recounted her tumultuous recent history, including her fight for custody of her son, arrest for drunk driving, her high-profile involvement in the 2010 season of Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew, and the death of her boyfriend, producer David Wilson. Her death came 1 month after Wilson also died by suicide, and according to reports, they were both discovered on the front porch of their home. Also found at the scene of her death was the body of the dog she shared with Wilson, and reports said that the dog had been shot and killed prior to her death. A friend of McCready's, Dan O'Hanks, spoke with E! News to explain that he didn't believe she had killed the dog out of despair, but love. Her discussions about leaving her life wasn't that she wanted to end her life, but she wanted to join David, and David loved that dog, and so she'd be taking the dog with her. Hanks also added that McCready had reached out to him the day prior to her death, and he said that it was an important lesson that everyone could take away with them. I wish I had been more alert to what it was. Everybody wants to reach out after the fact, but nobody wants to be there when it is happening. Nearly every wrestling fan will recognize the name Chris Benoit. He was such a high-profile star, in fact, that even those who didn't follow the sport knew his name. Over the course of his long career, Benoit racked up championship win after championship win and enjoyed status as a fan favorite for many years. Then, in 2007, he failed to show up to a number of scheduled events. When law enforcement went to his home to check on him, they found a truly horrifying scene. The subsequent investigation helped law enforcement lay out a grisly timeline of the events that occurred at Benoit's home, all over the course of one weekend. His wife Nancy was killed on the Friday. She was left with a Bible placed next to her. Daniel Benoit, the couple's 7-year-old son, was killed on Saturday. He was left in his bedroom surrounded by his wrestling figures, toy versions of wrestling memorabilia, and a Bible at his side. Benoit himself was found on a piece of exercise equipment, another Bible nearby. Although it was initially suspected that Benoit's killings stemmed from the consequences of steroid use, the WWE insisted that the careful placement of the Bibles indicated that the murders were premeditated. The organization said, "The presence of a Bible by each is not an act of rage. The physical findings announced by authorities indicate deliberation, not rage." An autopsy would later reveal that, at the time of the killings, Benoit had been suffering from extensive brain damage linked to a history of concussions. Ice hockey star Tim Horton was 44 years old at the time of his death. Over the years, he had accumulated a widely impressive 1,446 games, so when he died in 1974, it came as a massive shock to fans of the sport.
We had a game the next day, and a lot of us, I know I didn't, I hardly get through the game, I couldn't stop crying.
The initial reports revealed that Horton had been killed in a car accident on the Queen Elizabeth Way. There was a little more to it than that, though, and it wasn't until 2005 that the Ottawa Citizen petitioned for the release of the investigation reports under the Freedom of Information Act. It was then revealed that Horton's blood contained more than twice the legal limit of alcohol at the time of the crash. He was also found to have a prescription medication in his system, a mix of amphetamine and barbiturates that, at the time, was perfectly legal. Along with some of the items most people keep with them when they're on the road, including a suitcase, credit cards, a package of cigars, 8-track tapes, and a wallet, Horton was also carrying a number of pills. Authorities also found a bottle of Smirnoff at the scene, which had apparently been thrown from the car on impact. Initially, official reports said there were no signs that alcohol had been involved in the accident, and it wasn't until decades later that the truth finally came out. The sequence of events that led to the 2009 death of former Houston Oilers/Tennessee Titan and Baltimore Ravens quarterback Steve McNair has been hotly debated in the years since. The official ruling is that he was shot and killed by his girlfriend, Jenny Kazemi, before she died by suicide. But not everyone believes that was the case. Subsequent investigations have turned up scores of friends and family members who think there's more to the story than the official ruling suggested. Sports Illustrated's Tim Rohan has been at the forefront of keeping the case alive, explaining to People magazine, "These are people who were close to Jenny, who talk to her regularly, who talk to her on the final day of her life, who just don't believe that she did it." Of course, it's likely that there will always be those who think the police investigation was incomplete or wrong, and the items found at the scene were enough for police to consider it an open and shut case. They found a 9mm pistol that police traced back to a man who had sold it to Kazemi just 2 days before. The bullets used were matched to the same gun, and Kazemi was found to have gunpowder residue on her hands. Bloodstains were consistent with the findings too, and a countertop in the condo was lined with empty and half-used bottles of liquor. In October 1999, professional golfer Payne Stewart boarded a plane in Orlando. He was slated to play in the PGA Championship that year, but somewhere along the flight path to Houston, the crew stopped responding. The Air Force planes that subsequently intercepted the aircraft noticed it coasting along with little indication that anything was wrong. They did notice, however, that the cockpit window was frosted over. Military experts suggested that this could have indicated a loss of cabin pressure, likely rendering the crew and passengers unconscious or killing them outright.
The front to cockpit is either frosted or basically condensed over. I can't see inside in the cockpit.
At the same time, the plane continued on its journey and only stopped when it ran out of gas, crashing in a remote area of South Dakota. Investigators believe they were going to have a difficult time figuring out exactly what had gone wrong, as the crash site was restricted mostly to a 10-foot deep crater. It took around a month, but eventually investigators did find something at the scene that shed some light on what happened. The National Transportation Safety Board issued a statement regarding the discovery of the cockpit's voice recorder, on which they heard a series of low-pressure warning alarms. In 2018, Major League Baseball announced the deaths of two of their own, infielders Luis Valbuena, formerly of the Angels, and Jose Castillo, who had played for several teams, including the Pirates, Mariners, and the Astros. Both were playing for the Cardenales de Lara in Venezuela at the time of the car crash that killed them. Media reports pointed out that a rock had been found in the road near the accident site. At a glance, this might not seem all that important. However, the presence of the rock suggested the involvement of Venezuelan gangs in the two athletes' deaths. Rocks in the road are often placed there on purpose, with the goal of causing accidents that would leave victims easy targets to be robbed. It's such a problem, in fact, that sports teams tend to travel together under the protection of security details. The rest of the Cardenales have been doing exactly that on the day of the accident. Valbuena, Castillo, and the only survivor, third baseman Carlos Rivera, opted to travel separately as they had to make a stop at the U.S. Embassy. Soon after the accident, 4 individuals found in possession of the sports star's stolen belongings were arrested by Venezuelan authorities. Before he died by suicide in 2011, retired Chicago Bears safety Dave Duerson had been dealing with memory and language loss, and it was getting worse with every passing day. Notably, at the scene of his death, authorities found a note requesting that his brain be left to the NFL's brain bank. Treg Duerson, Dave's son, explained to the New York Times, he was looking for an answer, and he was hoping to be a part of an answer. The letter he left behind also contained final messages to his loved ones, which were kept private, but his family and friends have said that they felt it important to make his last wishes public. Alicia Duerson, the star's ex-wife, told the Times that this was his way of saying, "I'm a veteran of the game. Something is wrong. Somebody has to step up and acknowledge that."
There were times when we would meet after the game and he would want me to drive because he felt dizziness or he just didn't feel stable.
Several months after his death, Duerson's family found their answers. An examination of his brain diagnosed Duerson with the same dementia-like condition that had been found in the post-mortem examinations of dozens of other players, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Neuropathologist Dr. Ann McKee spoke to the New York Times about what she had found during her examination of his brain. She said, "It's tragic that Dave Duerson took his own life, but it's very meaningful that he recognized the symptoms of the disorder. It validates this condition." Marty Bergen might not be a household name today, but in the years leading up to the 20th century, he was widely known as one of the best catchers in baseball. Bergen was behind the plate for the National League Boston Beaneaters, which is the modern-day Atlanta Braves franchise. He was so good and had such a strong arm that players simply didn't steal bases when he was on the field, but he also carried demons with him. Modern medicine likely would have diagnosed him with schizophrenia and manic depression. In Bergen's time, though, these issues often went untreated. It suggested that the death of his son was the final straw for Bergen's mental health. He was away with the team when the toddler died of diphtheria in the last summer of the 19th century. Shortly after, on January 19, 1900, Bergen killed his wife, his 3-year-old son, his 6-year-old daughter, and then finally himself. Bergen's father, Michael, discovered the bodies of the family after entering their home, as well as a long-handled axe propped up in the hallway and a blood-soaked straight razor nearby. In sharp contrast, the kitchen stove had been cleaned out and preparation for a fresh fire had been laid. It's suspected that Bergen had been headed out to chop some wood for the fire when, after picking up the axe, something horrible took over.
Now to the story that is sending waves of astonishment through the sports world.
New England Patriots star Aaron Hernandez was serving a life sentence for murder when he died by suicide in 2017. Only after his death did an examination of his brain reveal that he had been suffering from an advanced case of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the very same condition that had afflicted Dave Duerson and countless other football players. Law enforcement issued an extensive report on the items found in his cell when his body was discovered. It was noted that Hernandez had taken several steps to make it difficult for the guards to see what he was doing. Initially, he hung a sheet over the window of his cell door to block the view from outside. When the guards went to open the door, they found he had jammed the mechanism with cardboard, something he had done before and been reprimanded for. He had also dumped shampoo on the floor. Written in blood on both the wall of his cell and on his own forehead was the phrase, John 3:16, a reference to the biblical verse, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." The blood seemed to have come from a cut on his finger, and more was found at his feet. Hernandez also left 3 suicide notes, one for his attorney, one for his daughter, and one for his fiancée. Arturo Gatti's boxing career was the stuff of legend, and by the time he retired from the ring in 2007, he had won 31 fights on knockouts alone. This fan-favorite boxer also engaged in an infamous rivalry with Mickey Ward, even once winning a tie-breaking fight against Ward while fighting with a broken hand. After retiring, he married, settled down, had a son, and then in 2009, died from an apparent suicide. Not everyone is convinced that he died by suicide, though. Ward, his fiercest rival, told CBS News, "I just can't see him taking his own life. That's just not him. Everything in life was going good for him." Some believe Gatti was killed, pointing to items found at the scene as evidence. For example, a number of blood-stained towels were found, which were never processed as evidence. A cut in the back of his head cast further doubt in the idea that he had died by suicide. On the other hand, close friends and family say that he struggled to adapt to retired life and struggled with alcohol addiction. And while some may have doubts, the official cause of death remains unchanged.